Phillips, Sr. I'm an American patriot, and the year is 1790. I was born in Virginia in 1728. My wife Elizabeth and I met and married in North Carolina. We judiciously moved to Georgia in 1773 with 5 sons and 2 daughters, the youngest of which was just 9 months old. My brother Zachariah and I had been part of the Regulators, a vigilance society dedicated to fighting exorbitant legal fees and the corruption of appointed officials in the frontier counties of North Carolina. The Regulators were led by Herman Husband, a Quaker, curiously enough, and we decided to move our families to Georgia with the Quakers for the sanctuary of retribution in North Carolina. We settled on land ceded by the Cherokees betwixt the Little River and Kettle Creek near Fort Heard, which later became Washington, Georgia. The forests abound with deer, black bear, wolf, wildcat, and small game such as squirrel and rabbit. Quail are secluded in the underbrush until they take flight with a mighty ruckus, and the clear, swift streams are full of fish. Although I legally obtained the land with no encumbrance from the government through Indian treaty, the Cherokees still deemed it their hunting grounds and were a threat to life and property from 1774 to 1783. My land is flanked on 2 sides by Cherokee and Creek Indian country. So I fortified the living quarters and outbuildings until our original property became recognized as Fort Phillips. I lost a good neighbor to the Indians in 1776, and Zachariah's nearby fort was burned to the ground in 1780. In those days, we reasoned the only threat to our safety and well-being would be from the Indians. Little River's constantly running water made the site a fine site for a mill. So I put up a grist mill to supply my family's needs and those of the public for wheat and buckwheat and flour and cornmeal. The millstones were cut from rock found in the Paris basin of the Seine River in France and were made of sedimentary stone. After the stones were cut, they were transported to the Savannah area by boat and onto this area by ox cart. My children were fascinated by the seashells in the stones. 16 of my neighbors were holding church services in the mill, so in 1786, I bequeathed the land on which Phillips Mill Baptist Church was built, and I helped to build it. I was privileged that the congregation chose me to give the church the name of my mill. The family worships at Phillips Mill Baptist Church, and we will likely be buried in the churchyard. Elizabeth has been a steadfast companion of good humor, and my offspring have made me very proud. I have endeavored to set an example for them as to how to be God-fearing, self-sufficient, and resourceful while being a contributing part of the community. I was past 50 years of age when the Revolutionary War came to Georgia. I had no way to know in the early years of the war that I would be skirmishing my own government in my own backyard. However, men with enough free will to come to America to develop a new land were much too independent to tolerate the mounting insufferable restrictions cast upon the colonies by the British. During my 62 years, I have amassed 950 acres of oak, hickory, and pine land with running creeks, which I consider to be my own parcel of paradise. There are many tales I could tell you about my life, some inspiring and some disheartening. But the story of the Battle of Kettle Creek is an account of the most harrowing time in my life, even more so than defending kith and kin from the Indians for nearly 10 years. About the time we arrived in Georgia in 1773, the American boycott of taxed British tea led to the Boston Tea Party, when shiploads of tea were destroyed. In 1775, the governor of Massachusetts learned that weapons were being gathered in Massachusetts, so he sent British troops to seize and destroy them. Local patriots confronted the troops, and they exchanged fire. Any chance of compromise was lost when the members of Congress were declared traitors by royal decree. They responded by declaring the independence of a sovereign nation, the United States of America, on July 4th in 1776. American loyalists rejected the declaration. The rest, I'm told, will be history. By 1779, Colonel James Boyd, with 600 British sympathizers, called Loyalists or Tories, was on his way to covey up with the British Army in Augusta to bring Georgia wholly under the King's control. The backwoods frontier of North Georgia proved to be difficult and severe for the British Army. In their dandy uniforms, whereas the terrain was familiar as our old smocks to us. Our one thorny issue was a recent barrage of thunderstorms, most unusual for February, that saturated the ground. When word reached the British that a few hardy, leathery farmers in North Georgia had formed a resistance movement in Fort Hurd, Colonel Boyd was ordered to scout the area. He was very wary since on February 11, 1779, the Georgia militia attacked Boyd's troops while they were fording a creek. In spite of the Patriots being heavily outnumbered, the Tories were hard to miss with their numbers and their bright red jackets. That encounter was how the Patriots came to know that the Loyalists were already in Wilkes County. In the secluded areas near Kettle Creek, on the night of February 13, 1779, Patriot troops commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Clark, Colonel John Dooley, and Colonel Andrew Pickens encamped. Colonel Pickens had 200 South Carolina militia, while Colonel Dooley and Lieutenant Colonel Clark, my commanding officer, had 140 Georgia militia in the area, primed to overtake the Loyalists, who were far too close to home to suit us. On the morning of February 14, 1779, Colonel Boyd and his men were camped beside a bend in the recently flooded Kettle Creek. The enemy was sleeping on my land. They had sentries posted, but their horses were grazing. Most of the men were busy slaughtering Phillips cattle or scavenging the countryside for food on my property. The political injustices of the government had now become personal. Early that morning, with only 340 men, the Patriots launched a surprise attack on the British forces bivouacked at Kettle Creek. The Tories had slept warm by the fire, but we had relinquished comfort for concealment. There were three Patriot columns. Colonel Dooley was on the right, Colonel Pickens was in the middle, and I was following Lieutenant Colonel Clark on the left. Colonel Pickens had sent an advance guard to go ahead of the columns to scout for the British. Our Patriot scouts happened upon the Loyalist sentries and opened fire. The gunfire alerted Colonel Boyd and squashed our surprise attack. Colonel Boyd rallied his men, took a small group, and advanced to a nearby hill where they waited behind rocks and fallen trees for cover. Colonel Pickens continued his advance to the top of the hill, but the two columns under Colonel Dooley and Lieutenant Colonel Clark were hindered by the high creek water, swamps, and canebrakes. On the approach of the Pickens Patriots, the Loyalists opened fire, and the lead men of the Patriot column immediately fell victim to the first rounds. It was bitter anguish to hear our fellow men yelling while we were impeded in getting to the battle. From the location of the cries, it sounded as if our side was losing. We struggled on even harder, determined to save this patch of Georgia from the tyranny of the British. Damn the flooded creek and damn the cold. It may sound far-fetched to yearn to arrive at a battle, but that's just how we felt. Our very independence was at stake, and we were fully prepared to die for it. By what may have been divine intervention, a Patriot musket ball mortally wounded the British commander, causing panic among the Loyalist militia, who pulled back pell-mell to the camp in a ravine. As Lieutenant Colonel Pickens Men gained the high ground above the camp, and men began to fire from above. The Loyalists realized their mistake and tried to escape by crossing Kettle Creek. Just as the forward Loyalist line made it to the far side of Kettle Creek, Colonel Dooley's men broke into the open. Suddenly, our column too broke out of the swamp, and the battle was on. By my God, it was brutal. The Loyalists began a second retreat more disorderly than the first. After 3 hours of perilous fighting on both sides of Kettle Creek, disorder turned into defeat. We had defended Kettle Creek, and by the grace of God, only 7 patriots were killed. Of the 600 Loyalist troops, at least 20 died at Kettle Creek, and another 22 were taken prisoner. The rest had, on the faith of it, seen enough of Georgia. Colonel Pickens was later quoted as saying that Kettle Creek was the severest check and chastisement of the Tories ever received in Georgia or South Carolina. That was a mighty fearful time in my life, and even though I'm a Christian, I'm not a man to forgive and forget easily. To leave your family and go to war only to return and hear about the suffering and malice endured by your beloved wife at the hands of the enemy is mighty hard to abide. My intense loathing of the British festered like a boil long after the war ended. We were building Phillips Mill Baptist Church. We had placed on the log floor joists, but had not yet made the structure floored. The congregation, in the meantime, was sitting on those logs, which were sleepers for the building. Just before services on one Sabbath, I was in the church building, kneeling in prayer, when a Tory entered. I pray that the uncharitable act that followed will be soon forgotten. With God as my witness, I rose from my knees, stepped from log to log to where the Loyalist was sitting, and ousted the intruder. Taking him by the scuff of the neck, I escorted him back across the room and aided a resounding kick out the door. When I resumed my prayers, I did so with apparent approval of the entire congregation. My faith assures me that God has forgiven me, and he may have also even approved. Praise